In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. So nice to be with you here yet again. This is episode 81, I believe. We are going to be talking about, the next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about the problem of evil and phrased in a couple different ways. So today we're going to look at the problem of divine hiddenness, or where is God? And oftentimes, although this doesn't necessarily get into the problem of evil, I find that it often does. Where is God when it hurts? People might be asking themselves. And so we're going to talk about divine hiddenness today. And then next week, we'll be discussing the pastoral problem of evil and how different models of providence kind of play into recognizing how we might be dealing with evil and suffering in our lives or the lives of others. So before we jump into today's show, and it will be an interesting show today because we're going to be going through a special website that's made wonderfully and helps guide people's thoughts to have them well ordered and well structured. It's very important, I think, to have well-ordered thoughts on any given topic, and our guest today has done just that. We'll be talking about that more momentarily. But first, I must share this image that a guest put up on our Facebook page this week. For those that are longtime listeners, they know that my favorite beverage on planet Earth is the one that has 23 flavors. And it really does make the world taste better. As the old slogan said, Dr. Pepper makes the world taste better. So I believe Chris will be getting up here the image of the Dr. Pepper shirt, that it runs through my blood, if ever I run low. All right. So just a couple of things. If you'd like to participate in today's discussion, there are a couple ways you can do that. I'm following along here on the live stream, and I'm looking at your comments. You can email me, kurt@veracityhill.com, and you could also check out our texting plan. Text the word Veracity. That's VERACITY to the number 555-888, and I'll get your text messages too. So we're joined today by Blake Giunta. He is the founder of the Belief Map website, beliefmap.org. And we got a little bit of a late start here today, Blake, but thank you so much for joining us on today's show.
My pleasure. How are you?
Good. So I've known you for, I guess it's been a few years now, and I know a couple years ago you've partnered with Defenders Media here, being part of the Defenders Alliance, the Belief Map website, and I've just really loved what you've done with it. Before we go through and even demonstrate in today's show how the website works, tell me what your vision was for your ministry here.
Oh, man. So I, as a young budding apologist, recently come to take Christianity seriously as a result of apologetics myself. Would get on chat rooms, and I'd be talking with people, growing and learning there. And in the process, I'd have a Word document that would have my notes, because you need to be prepared to give an answer. So I would develop this note system that I would use in my evangelism in this chat room and talking to people at carm.org, Matt Slick's site. And in the process, it became unmanageable. It was too much. And I discovered a program that's called an outliner, and this allows you writers usually use it normally, and you have two panes. You have one pane for your articles, which you can nest hierarchically, and then you can just click them and it loads the article on the right. So a really cool tool. And in this particular outliner, I could actually color the nodes, as they're called, differently. And I just hit upon the system. Hey, what if I represented my claims in green, the possible responses in red, my counter responses in green, I could map this whole darn conversation out. And so I started doing this and building my note system, and it blew me away at how powerful it was. And so I would come into this chat room, and it would get to the point where the rest of the apologists would celebrate because I was the guy that would have all of the, quotations ready for the conversation that they happened to be in at the moment.
Yeah.
And this was happening. I was in high school, And so anyways, I was doing this, and it just dawned on me as I was working through building the resurrection section and having a conversation with someone on that, that, man, I could stand up right now, walk away. And I had just heard my mom in the kitchen, and it was like, she could come in here and she could sit at this chair and she could complete this conversation just based on my notes.
Yeah. Nice.
And so from that point, it was just like a big vision at that point. It's like, wow, what if I could create this sort of pocket apologist, this system, and empower apologists and bloggers and people everywhere with this thing to like quickly learn how the debate unfolds and for them to be able to go into conversations feeling prepared, and at the same time offer something for non-believers who don't like to read books, which unfortunately is a lot of the new atheist crowd today, but do like to argue.
Yeah.
And they do like to, they enjoy the back and forth.
Yeah.
So anyways, I hit upon this idea, and then I would spend the next several years just building out the system and figuring out how to make it work. And then a couple of years ago, it finally launched. And it, people are loving it. It's helping a lot of people too, and we're really excited about it and where it's going to be going.
Yeah, great. And now, in addition to the website here, you have a speaking ministry. Aside from, of course, interviews and talks that you give, you've done a number of different debates. So tell me about that and your interest in debating, those in the atheist community.
Yeah, as far as my interest in public debating, it's kind of zero. It's one of those things. I don't know if it's God's plan versus mine, but it's kind of foist upon me to have some of these debates. So I guess I was on Dogma Debate Radio a few times starting out, or actually it was one time starting out, and I guess the hosts who weren't well trained in philosophy got enough negative feedback in terms of their interaction with me and feeling like, hey, someone who knows philosophy needs to interact with this guy, that they invited me back on the show, and they pulled in a guy named Justin Schieber, who is a very sophisticated atheist.
Yeah.
And we had a really good conversation, and somehow that turned into, he wanted to do a debate at the University of Texas at Dallas, and so lo and behold, I had a first debate. That was fun. Justin's a great interlocutor.
Yeah.
But from there, I guess I had, I was known as a local Dallas debater, and next they had the Bible and Beer Consortium, a really interesting venue. They a lot of times people won't go into churches to have these debates,
right?
Because the non-believer might feel uncomfortable. It's like, why? Well, I don't want to go in there. So they hold these things in bars, and it's like neutral ground, and everybody can come. It's a really cool idea that Ezra put together.
Yeah.
But anyways, Matt Dillahunty is a really kind of prominent.
The Atheist Experience is his show, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And he's been doing that for something like over a decade.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And people, he's like a YouTube personality, really prominent.
Yeah.
And anyway, so Ezra set up a debate with me and Matt Dillahunty on the existence of God, and we had that. And then since then, I've debated Matt several different times. I debated him in San Diego University there, and I debated him in Dallas again.
Yeah.
On the resurrection. I've been on radio with Dogma Debate. I've been on a few podcasts with him. I've been at his house and we recorded 2 episodes. So I've had a lot of interactions with Matt.
Yeah.
So that's been good.
Yeah, good.
And then,
nice.
Just podcasts here and there. So
right. Yeah, including today's. So
that's right.
Before we jump into the website and going through today's topic on divine hiddenness, perhaps you could give us an overview on what do people mean when they talk about the problem of divine hiddenness?
Yeah. So when lay people hear it, they might think of the question of why Doesn't God make his existence more clear when salvation is on the line, and there are so many people out there. If they don't hear the gospel, then they don't get saved, and isn't this doesn't make sense if the Christian God exists. That's not quite what the problem of divine hiddenness is. The problem of divine hiddenness is broader. It's related. It has nothing to do with the afterlife. Instead, it focuses on a property that God is supposed to have if God is all good, and the property in question is God's being perfectly loving. This is how a guy named John Schellenberg frames the argument, and he's the most prominent advocate of this. And so the gist of the argument is that if God's all good, then God's all loving, right? And if God's all loving, then he's going to make sure that we have everything that we need in order to be able to enter into relationship with him at any time. Okay, he thinks that this just falls out of the idea of God's being perfectly loving, which in turn falls out of God's being a perfect being. So if God exists, God would make sure we always have everything we need to be in relationship with him. And
so from that broad perspective, then we get the
next premise, right?
Yeah.
Not everybody has everything that they need to be in a relationship with God. In particular, people don't have belief. And belief, the point is something that's quite required in order to be in relationship with God. And so from this, we get to conclude. So therefore, there is not this perfectly loving being. And from there, we obviously don't have a perfect being. We don't have God. And that's the gist of the argument.
The argument as it's structured. And of course, this has led people to be concerned about, the eternal state or the eternal place of, say, their neighbor or a family member, or even, as I had mentioned before we got going here, on the problem of evil, that, God, if God were perfectly loving, he would make himself more aware to me in this moment of my suffering.
Sorry. If I couldn't hear the introduction, so if you said something about relating it to hell, then
okay.
My apologies.
No.
Because it does tie into that ultimate question as well. Especially that's a concern for a lot of Christians. I know it's a question that I struggled with. But the divine hiddenness issue proper is strictly an argument against the Western notion of God as a perfectly great being. It doesn't limit itself to Christianity. The hiddenness argument runs against Islam. It runs against everything. So yeah.
Yeah, good. Well, why don't we hop over to the website here, and those that are I feel sorry for people that are listening to this, on the podcast, downloaded. I would encourage you, if that's you, to go over to beliefmap.org right now so you can follow along. Those that are watching on the live stream, we're going to get the website up here for you. And Chris, our technical producer, has got it already up, so that's good. And so, all right, I'm at the main website here. Blake, tell me, where do I go next?
Yeah, and just to describe for people who are just listening, what they're seeing. Like I mentioned before, this resembles the notes that I mentioned a moment ago. On the right pane this is where the articles are going to load, and what are going to pop up are these kind of quotes, sayings, and they're going to be either green or red, depending on who's saying it. On the left, you have miniature versions of those quotes, and this is for fast navigation. So left of Belief Map, because our ultimate goal, or at least at Belief Map, my ultimate goal is to get people right. I want to remove those obstacles that would prevent them from accepting that Jesus is Lord, that their sins are paid for, and they have an opportunity to be in a relationship with God through Him. And moving through those objections for most people to get them past basic skepticism to the gospel. I want to get them to understand that God exists. I want that to be an option for them. The next big topic on Belief Map in the menu is Jesus a real historical figure? Then does Jesus stand out like one chosen by God? Right? Okay, I'm about to give you evidence for the resurrection, but if I gave you evidence for the resurrection of my next door neighbor, you're wary of that evidence. And what's happening in the background is it would be very helpful to have a reason to think, why God would raise Jesus uniquely. So that's what that one is. And then finally, the last issue on Belief Map is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And if we can establish that Jesus rose from the dead, then it's game over, right? I mean, that takes you to at least the trust from there, but that gets you to the basic message.
Yeah, nice.
And right now, this question goes under the first topic. So we're going to click on God exists. This is a claim that Green is making.
Okay.
And when we click on this, what drops down are all the other speech bubbles of evidences for God's existence. And we also have here under that the 4 objections to God's existence, which are in red. And we're going to go down to not that God's properties require contradictions, not that God's extraordinary, not that God would have ensured less suffering to occur, but God would have ensured more believe. So go ahead and click on that. And you're going to see a summary there. If you want to go ahead and click on the first one, my first response to this claim just below, the response is briefly in the left pane that no, this non-believer, would have just immediately rejected relationship. So go ahead and click on that.
Okay.
So let me summarize this particular response so that people understand what this is. So remember, the grand objection, a loving God existed, God would ensure that we know he existed in order to foster relationship, right? And here's my first response is that you can't say that, Mr. Non-Believer, because, quote, some people would just immediately reject relationship. Some resistant non-theists, upon coming to belief, would immediately reject loving relationship. And people can dive into reasons for why we know this, but it's straightforward enough, right? I mean, many people testify that even if God existed, they'd still resist relationship with God. Right? And we also have several historical examples of people who believed that God existed and yet chose not to follow God.
Yeah, and so we could even think of it in terms of our human relationships. I mean, we have enough evidence that person A exists, but we still don't want to be friends with them.
Exactly.
We still don't want to, be in a loving, caring relationship, one where we might have to humble ourselves in any given situation. I know marriage is good for that sort of thing, as I'm sure you know, along with myself. So some people just don't want that sort of relationship. And for some people, it's not about the evidence, because they would just immediately reject being in that relationship.
Yeah. And what's key here is to understand that God's whole specified motivation to ensure that someone believes that he exists, the whole specified motivation was to allow for relationship. So if God knows that this person isn't going to take advantage of that relationship, then clearly we have at least some people who we can't expect God to ensure that they believe. That's just, and he doesn't have reason to. So right off the bat, the premise from the divine hiddenness argument is too strong. He would need to modify his claim to something like, if a loving God existed, he would ensure that everyone knows it, provided that everyone is limited to people who would choose to be in relationship. And that's still a significant problem, but it's a change from what the original claim was.
Yeah, nice. I like how you've nuanced that. Because you're right. I mean, it goes from all people to, well, really just only the people that would want to be in relationship with him.
Right. And that theme is going to continue as we work through the rest of these. And it's going to become a death by 1,000 slashes.
Yeah.
So,
okay. Well,
so here's our next objection.
Yeah, what do we got?
Once again, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, let's keep moving along here. See more about the website.
Cool. So again, the claim is if a loving God existed, would God, or God would ensure that we know it to foster a relationship. The second kind of objection would be to say, no, that's not right at all, because some people would just have an improper relationship. Okay, so some non-theists would just form this not at one moment, but a perpetually improper relationship with God if, in their current state, they suddenly believed and even entered into a kind of relationship with God. So I have a big chunk of examples that you can explore on Belief Map, but just to summarize them, You can have these relationships where, hey, I'll be, buddy with God, but I'm not going to recognize as God. I'm not even going to recognize. Some people won't even recognize God as good. And the thing is if you want to try to be in a relationship with God Almighty and reject God good, this is the kind of relationship that at least plausibly is improper, and that would actually be worse to have than for God just to leave it alone. So it can be the kind of thing that God would rightly avoid. Another type of bad relationship, improper relationship, would be one where the human rejects moral transformation. Right? So at the end of the day, as I understand things, God is wanting to eliminate evil in the world. He is tolerating evil for a time, but it will be destroyed. That's where we're heading towards. And the whole idea behind heaven is we need to be able to enter into a situation where we can give ourselves over to God as God. And it's precisely this giving ourselves over to God that will put us in a situation where we no longer sin. It's only God that can transform us and make us heaven ready. If God took one of us right now and yanked us into heaven, we'd just destroy heaven because it's supposed to be a place without sin. So once again, God has reason to reveal himself more to people who are ready to be transformed. And not all people, even if they claim they're ready, actually are ready. They would reject that transformation.
Yeah, right.
Another kind of improper relationship that looms on the horizon for some people is that they would lack a right desire for God. So we know that there are people out there who basically they don't love God. This isn't an actual relationship in the strong sense that we ought to have with God. These are people that just pray to God and praise God to receive these religious experiences that they can conjure up in themselves. God is just a tool for them. It's not real. It's not real, a relationship. Some people do this only to escape punishment from God. And there's a question about whether this is a genuine kind of relationship. Like you haven't recognized God. You don't know God. And you may believe that's there, but this is, the kind of, relationship that a demon might adopt. I'm sure I'll, do what you want, but I'm only doing it for my own escape this.
Right. Yeah. The stay out of hell free card.
Yeah, exactly. And if that's your reason, then God would have reason to kind of hide himself from you he would lack motive to ensure that you believe.
Yep.
And before I continue, one of the things to keep in mind with this is often a mercy for people, because if God led them to come into belief in him at this moment when they're only going to enter into an improper relationship, it could preclude an opportunity in the future that God could have set up where they would have been right-minded. So bringing them to belief now could actually sabotage their future relationship, interestingly enough. Another kind of relationship. Sometimes people enter into a relationship with God just because they think they'll get gifts out of it. So we all know about the prosperity gospel and things that are related to it.
Yeah.
Once again, this isn't about God. This is about me. This is about using God as a tool.
Like Santa Claus.
There you go. That's right. Yeah. So those are examples of when a human might lack the right desire for God. There are other examples of improper relationships outside of lacking right desire. We already covered moral transformation and not recognizing God as good. But also some humans, Travis Dumsday wrote an article on this. And interesting. Some humans actually would become jealous of God. So this is the situation that Satan was in. There are reasons to think that history have had this notion where you can recognize God as good, and at the end of the day, you can grow jealous of God's power and the praise offered him. And if that's you, then once again, God has a reason to hold back on trying to start a relationship with you at this moment, or ensuring that you come to belief.
So someone of this sort might be the person who thinks they could run the world better than God himself.
And how many Christians even think that right now as they approach the issue of homosexuality and so forth? They think, look, this is wrong. I don't agree with God's values. I could do better. And that is the that is the original lie.
Yep.
And humans are prone to fall into it. So this, if you are such a human, then there is not a clear reason why God would ensure that you come to belief at this moment.
Interesting. Yeah.
Finally, for this category of improper relationships that God might refrain from starting, is one, and this is Paul Moser wrote a book on this called The Elusive God. He covers this in depth. But there's actually something inappropriate in a situation where the human considers himself an authority in its formation. And long actually considering him, if you're going to make God jump through hoops, right, like a pet lion, you're not getting the right concept of God again. And this can be an improper relationship that God could have reason to, avoid. So that's 5 examples of improper relationships, and one of those 5 had 3 sub-examples.
Yeah, right.
But these are all relevant, again, because an improper relationship of this kind could be such that it's better for it to have never existed. And so if you're going to modify, right, the claim, now it's got to be something like, if a loving God existed, God would ensure that we know it, as long as we limits it to people who would enter into a relationship and would enter into a relationship that's not any one of these relationships that I just covered.
Right. So now you're going from like 100% of the population to, I don't know, 15 or 20% of the population maybe.
Yeah, and what's powerful about this is you don't know. Like, you're not in a position to say if someone is such that they would come to be jealous, or that they would be jealous in that moment. Yeah.
So even just from this first point alone about the improper, or I guess the improper relationship here, you can see just how complex the web of thought and argumentation is, but nevertheless how helpful a tool like Belief Map can be to help keep our thoughts and our arguments organized. As a point-counterpoint website.
Yeah, and if you run into someone who raises this kind of objection, I mean, that's all I'm doing right now is I'm just you can see it. I'm pretty much reading from the page. It's just an outline. You can use it for your apologetics presentations. It's a great way to learn, and if you don't remember all the answers on the spot, you can yank this up and it's all in outline form ready for you.
Yeah, nice.
So, you want to move to the next one?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So we've been kind of talking about persons who would enter into an improper relationship, but it actually goes further than that, is because God would also have reason to refrain from people who would leave proper relationship later in life, right? So some non-theists, if they became theists, would enter into a proper relationship with God, but then they'd abandon it later in life. And here we go through the same kinds of reasons that we discussed up above. They could come to disbelieve in God's goodness. They could come to grow jealous of God. Yet one example that you see among Christians is, well, I don't like that God allows suffering. Okay, it falls into the category of kind of disagreeing with God's approach of things. Yeah. Or because someone falls in love with their sin more than God eventually. Yep. And so once again, we get to modify our big claim up at the top, where the claim now has to be, if God existed, God would ensure that we know it, as long as the person is open and desiring of a relationship. They would enter into a proper relationship that doesn't fit any of these categories, and not only would they enter into the proper relationship, they would stay in that proper relationship. And so again, go ahead.
I wouldn't hear those an atheist say something like, but wouldn't that short time still be worth it?
Okay, yeah. So incidentally, that is covered. So if you click on...
Of course it is.
If you click on this particular response, Red is saying, Red is the non-believer. He says, no, God doesn't exist because God would have ensured more belief. Then Green says, no, they would just abandon relationship later. Then Red comes back and says, well, so what? A short relationship is worth it to God. So I'm going to click on that now and let's see what it says. All right, so right below, we see a list of 4 points here. So first is, is that God could hate this, much like we would hate divorce. So I'm just reading from the site here. Plausibly, entering into a relationship with God and abandoning it later could be to God a great evil analogous to divorce. And this is relevant because such a great evil have been better for it to have never existed. How does that sound? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right, good. It can also, here's the next point, it can also cause the human harm. So God can know that starting this relationship or starting it at this particular time would actually cause the individual harm in the long run. And again, these open up into links. But for example, it could preclude a better conversion time. It can also result for the person who comes into a relationship, then it could result in more crime and punishment. Because remember, this person eventually is going to exit out of relationship with God. Right. That's the whole premise. That's the whole premise of this objection.
That's right.
But now we've basically made them more accountable. So they've come into a relationship and now they're rejecting it. Now they're more accountable than ever. And if they're eventually going to enter into a state of judgment and punishment for their sin because they've rejected the gift that we've been given, more punishment is bad.
Yeah. And so hence why God wouldn't give this person, say, more evidence of his existence or something like that, because in the long run, it's going to not be good for this person. So
So, the idea is, hey, maybe God would bring this person into a relationship for a period because at least, even if they'll exit relationship eventually, that short period is worth it. That short period is good. And I'm saying, no, it's actually not good. It's like divorce on the one hand, which is just wrong on its own right. God wouldn't want to create a divorce situation. And secondly, it can hurt the person in the long run. It can preclude a better conversion time. We talked about that. So bringing some non-believers immediately into a relationship could preclude this time of conversation, which would yield better results. For example, it could yield a stronger relationship with God if God just holds off a little. So Travis Dumsday, I'm going to go ahead and throw in a quote here. He says, quote, God must moderate his self-disclosure, delaying his personal revelations until we have some sense of our own fallenness and a measure of humility. And for those who do develop the necessary virtues such that they can handle open relationship with God, God will eventually grant such open relationship. In the meantime, uncertainty about ultimate questions brings home to us our own limitations, helping to build up the requisite virtue of humility and prompting us to seek diligently for the answers, which act of seeking, if persisted in, will itself build both humility and a greater love of truth.
Yeah. So clearly these are not ideas that people have not thought about before either. I know.
Yeah, no, this is all – I mean, if you look at the top, the bibliography here is – I mean, I've got, probably over 40 stuff. This is my big research project at Moody.
Yeah, nice.
And for a few months of 2017. So I worked through a bunch of material and I basically mapped it all out.
Yeah.
So it's all here now.
I know I've engaged with a number of atheists online and I can't help but get the impression for some of them that their thoughts are just so novel, as if, no one had ever thought of these ideas before. And I wish that some of them were a bit more well-read, because there's nothing new under the sun. People have considered these issues before and ideas, and sometimes maybe the ideas were phrased differently than they might have hoped, but nevertheless the principle was there. And so it's great that you've kind of laid it all out for us from the people who have already thought about this subpoint of a subpoint of a subpoint.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. All right, so we've got to move on to other points here, but before we get to that, Blake, we do have to take a short break from our sponsors. And so I hope for those that are following online, you'll stick with us through a couple minutes here, and then we'll get a nice, fun round of rapid questions for Blake. He's probably thinking, what's rapid questions? Exactly. So stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Have you heard of the Google Ad Grant for nonprofits? 501c3 nonprofit organizations can receive $10,000 per month in online advertising credit from Google, empowering you to share your message with the world. At Defenders Media, we partnered with Nonprofit Megaphone, an agency focused solely on Google grant acquisition and management. They got us approved for the grant and now manage ad campaigns, bringing hundreds of new people to our websites each month. If you are eligible, Nonprofit Megaphone will acquire and manage the grant for you for a month for free to see if they can help you too. Visit nonprofitmegaphone.com to learn more.
Hello, I'm David Smith, the Executive Director of Illinois Family Institute, a state-based Christian pro-life and pro-family public policy organization. I want to invite you to join us as we seek to be salt and light to a dark and rapidly decaying culture. You can do that in a number of ways. For example, you can join our email list to get timely alerts and great cultural commentaries. You can like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter, listen to our podcasts, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can attend one or more of the special events and forums we host in different parts of the state. We do all these things to encourage and equip Christians in Illinois. You see, we need you to help us fulfill our mission to boldly bring a biblical perspective to public policy. Our faith requires us to be bold, speak truthfully, and love our neighbors. Join us. Visit illinoisfamily.org to learn more.
All right, thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you're just joining us now, today we're talking about divine hiddenness with Blake Giunta, the founder of beliefmap.org, a wonderful website that'll guide you through the argumentation, the point, counterpoint, and various subpoints, and really help keep your mind well ordered, especially for some of these issues, which for some of us can be, quite personal, and we might carry some baggage when exploring some of these ideas that might sometimes affect our thinking. And so that's why I've appreciated Blake's ministry here, not just his website, but his speaking ministry as well. So I'm pleased to have him on today's show. Before we get back to the discussion, we do have to get to rapid questions here. But before we do that, I was told during the break here that our software program had a little hiccup and we weren't able to show that image of the Dr. Pepper shirt. So I'm wondering if Chris might be able to get that up here. There it is. All right. In case of accident, what does it say there? My blood type is Dr. Pepper. So again, if you're a longtime listener, you know how much I love that beverage. And so in case I do get into an accident, just make sure there's a Dr. Pepper for me. Of course, I wouldn't actually want to put Dr. Pepper through my veins, but figuratively speaking, that is the truth. Okay, now, Blake, if you are ready, we have a round of rapid questions, which are just goofy, fun questions. And since you're a first-time guest, you will have 60 seconds here to get through these questions. So I will start the game clock, which you won't be able to hear, but we'll know when it ends. And so just try to get through these as quickly as you can. So are you ready?
Yes.
All right, here we go. What is your clothing store of choice?
Don't have one.
Taco Bell or KFC?
KFC.
What school did you go to?
Birmingham.
What song is playing on your radio these days?
Song, I have not listened too long. Pass.
Where would you like to live?
Wherever my wife is.
Oh, nice. What's your favorite sport?
Wrestling.
What kind of razor do you use?
Gillette.
What's your spouse's favorite holiday?
She likes, wine. Wine color.
For a favorite holiday?
No. Her favorite holiday?
Yes.
Christmas.
Christmas. All right.
Christmas.
What fruit would you say your head is shaped like?
It's a perfectly attractive orange.
Okay. Have you ever planked?
Planked?
Yeah.
No.
You haven't planked. All right, last question. Do you drink Dr. Pepper?
I guess who doesn't drink Dr. Pepper?
Amen to that, brother. Who doesn't drink Dr. Pepper? All right. Well, thank you for playing that round of rapid questions. They kind of threw you off there, huh?
Hey, I like to keep me on my toes.
That's right. That's the idea.
Keeps the brain young.
Yeah, it does. Okay, so let's get back to the discussion here. So we're talking about the problem of divine hiddenness. And broadly speaking, it's the concern that if God were to exist and that he be, perfectly good and loving, that he would make his existence more known to people, whatever their life circumstance might be. And so this has implications for how we might deal with the problem of evil, how we might think about the eternal resting place of our neighbors or loved ones that don't believe in God, and a host of other factors that the broad concept deals with. And beliefmap.org, which is a website that we're going through on the show today, can lead us point by point going through those important issues, but also recognizing here how some of the objections raised in this argument might not be as strong as some suggest. There are some problems with thinking that, say, everyone would just believe if God made himself, if God wrote, I exist in the clouds or the stars, that wouldn't guarantee what a person might suspect it would. And so we're going through these different points that Blake has prepared for us as part of a research project that he's done and now has made available here on the website. So if you're following along on the live stream, we're going to get this back up for you here shortly. And if you're listening on iTunes or Google Play, which I hope you put in a good review for this show from time to time, you can also just load up your web browser, push pause on your player right now, hop on a computer or your smartphone, and load up beliefmap.org and follow along with us as we go through this today. All right, Blake, so let's pick up where we last left off. I believe, would that have been point 3 or 4 here?
Yeah, so we're on 4. So
okay.
You want me to just go right in?
Take it away.
All right, so once again, green is claiming God exists, and red is basically coming back in, no, God doesn't exist. If any God would have ensured that more people believe. And in particular, this is the hiddenness argument. So they're saying that if a loving God existed, he'd ensure that we know it to foster relationship. That's the idea that they're planting in to make. And we've raised a few objections with this bold claim of theirs, and it's forced them to modify their grand claim. We talked about how some people would just immediately reject relationship. Some people would just have an improper relationship with God, one that God wouldn't want to exist, or that maybe they could enter into a proper relationship at first, but there are all these reasons why they might abandon proper relationship later in life and then not enter into ultimate relationship with God in the end. And that, too, is something that God has reason to refrain from bringing about. We have 2 more grand types of problems with red's objection, the atheist's objection here. But both of these are very deep. They've got a lot of subtopics to get into. Okay. The first one is that total greater goods can obtain with God being silent. So if God is silent to some degree, we have a massive list of good things that there can be more of in the world. And you can only get this quantity of these goods in the presence of hiddenness. And then the next one's going to be that God can have a relationship with some people actually even during their disbelief. So let's jump into, and this is where we'll spend most of our time, if not all of it, is that total greater goods can obtain with divine silence. Now, this does take kind of a utilitarian approach. If you want to argue from hiddenness from what's called a deontological perspective and say that God owes it to us, I think that has some pretty clear objections that you can come up with. But if someone but most people resonate with this consequentialist approach as well. And so, for example, I'm going to go through the list and then we can dive into the ones that you're interested in.
Sure.
But some examples are this. One is there can actually be more relationship goods in light of some divine silence in the world. You can get more justice, it's argued. It's also argued that you can get more mercy, ironically. You can get more moral knowledge. You can get more seeking of God. And you can get more uncoerced moral choices. Okay?
So I could see here an atheist might say, well, if God, say, were to show up in physical form and just gave us instructions on how we should run our societies, we could have an easy way to understand justice because God would just tell it to us. So why doesn't he do just that?
Well, I mean, so if there's two ways to approach that. If he's just asking out of curiosity, I can speculate. I don't have to know. If he's raising it as an argument, I'm going to be pushing back on him just as a matter of keeping in mind who's got the burden of proof here.
Okay.
Well, I mean, you're making an argument here about what God would do, and you're going to need to justify that a bit more. So I'm not. I mean, I recognize. There can be some goods from God doing this and coming in and being clear with us about here's how you can order society to have a better world overall. Here's the perfect government for this particular country in this particular situation. I can see good in his doing that, but merely recognizing a good out of some situation is not nearly enough to justify the belief that this is what God would do. Because you also have to take into account the goods that come about from God not doing it that way. And you also have to take into account the harms, the relative harms from both options. In the case, when I talk about justice here, I don't know if that's what you're relating it to, but when I say that you can get more justice in the presence of divine hiddenness, more punishing of sin, I'm taking and this is to back up real quick. What I'm articulating here are the responses that you're going to find in the academic literature. Okay, so this isn't. This is a more Calvinistic approach. Whether you agree with it or not, this is at least an option for the Christian defender who wants to throw that option out at people. But what he's going to say is that it's actually good. There is good when God punishes someone justly. If he punished them more than they deserved, that would be bad.
Sure.
At the same time, if he punished them less than they deserved, you could also say that there's a downside to that. So one good of God not revealing himself to some people is that the person does receive the right amount of justice. They don't get the get out of hell free card. They get punished to the perfectly just degree. And I know this is kind of like rubs some people the wrong way, but you can very plausibly argue that as long as God punishes them to the perfectly just degree, this is a good thing. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, and it strikes me, too, as a non-Calvinist that seems compatible with a non-Calvinist approach.
Good. Yes.
I mean, that God is just. Yeah, right. Okay, so I follow, and in some ways, excuse me, we might think that... excuse me. We might think that even according to the Christian tradition that Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, that was God's act of justice by separating himself from their unholiness, his holiness from their unholiness. And in that sense, that is punishing the human not just condition, but all of humanity for our present state, because we won't get access to the goods of the garden according to the traditional story, and so I don't think that's something that should be of too concern for some people, but maybe people that think in sort of the lovey-dovey God, Jesus is my homeboy hypothesis, does this idea of a God of justice, both retributive justice, but maybe also restorative justice, is something that they have yet to consider. So,
yeah, I've found, I mean, even among like really good, devout, Jesus-loving Christians, some of them have not fully come to grips with the idea that God's punishment is a good thing. Now we're grateful, incredibly grateful that we don't undergo that punishment, the punishment that we deserve. We're incredibly grateful, but I think that when we do look at other people who ultimately do get judged and they don't receive that gift, as we mature in our Christianity, we do want to understand that when God exemplifies His justice, that's a good thing, just as when God exemplifies His loving kindness and mercy.
Yeah.
These are both great making properties of God. And so here, when we're thinking about, would God ensure that more believe? We went over a few different reasons why no, that's not. You point to any particular person, and I can give you all these plausible reasons for why God might not reveal Himself to that individual. But for this final category, we're picking out a list of goods that we can even add together. And so, if we want to find out what's the ultimate value of hiddenness. One thing that we want to think about is how much extra of God's good justice comes into the world as a result of it. That's just a fact. You just have to include it.
Yeah.
So that's the first one.
Yeah.
And then next, you also have to think about the mercy that hiddenness buys. So the more mercy or refraining from just punishment may come at the cost of more divine hiddenness. Yeah. You can get more moral knowledge. Actually, this is really popular.
Let me, if I may, Blake, on the concept of mercy, I've thought of an interesting analogy here. When I was a kid and I got in trouble, and I did my parents wrong, even if my father was not yet home because he was at work, boy, would I fear when the time when my father would come home, because I knew punishment was coming. And so when you say that there's a greater good here, that there's more mercy, I know what that means, because some, I think, should be able to understand what that feeling's like of just waiting for the impending judgment, the further extent of justice. I know earlier, just a couple minutes ago, I was thinking more of the justice in the now, but of course, the justice that is to come. Yeah, there is greater mercy in letting there be a longer period of time before my father were to come home from work. So I remember that when I was a kid, and so maybe that would be an apt analogy here, that the mercy is greater in the longer period of time that there is to wait or to see things as they will become. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Continue.
Another thing, and this is pretty straightforward, is that with more hiddenness, you have more of this really valuable virtue of seeking God. So I've got this links to a whole article on why seeking God is a great good. So the idea of a person, we get to order our lives how we want. That's one of our decisions, is how we order our life, and it's a great good when we order our life so that we pursue good and we pursue good, genuinely good things. And God is the greatest good, and so hiddenness allows us to pursue God in a very special way, and what can come out of it is incredibly valuable as well. The story that gets involved with it, the value that you attribute to the object when you finally obtain it. There's a lot written on there as well.
Yeah.
Another one is, and this is probably more is written about this than anything else, is that there's more uncoerced moral choices. I'm sure you've heard of this one.
Yes.
In light of hiddenness. So morally significant freedom may come at the cost of more divine hiddenness. And so the idea here is that if God made his existence very, very overtly clear to us, it's actually going to sabotage the ability for us to express ourselves as children of God with free will and moral choice. And there are different ways it can sabotage it. All have been written on. Our choices could be coerced by fear of punishment. Right, so imagine living life with this feeling that you almost have a highway patrolman on your back at everything you do. That is a real threat in a world where God's existence is overtly clear in the way that a lot of hiddenness arguers advocate.
Yeah.
The other one is when you have too strong of an enticement of reward. Okay, so it's commonly believed that if you want to genuinely have free choices, you need to be able to see reasons to do A and not A, to do both. And if it can't be overwhelming one way or the other, because if it's overwhelming, then you don't have a genuine alternative possibility.
Yeah.
So if the enticement of reward was too strong, this could snuff out free will as well, just like fear of punishment could. Similarly, the desire for God's proposal, Richard Swinburne wrote a bit on this, can be something that can affect your free will in a kind of sabotaging way. And then on top of this, you have to take into account that even if none of them are sufficient all on their own, if you collapse all of them together, how much would this affect people's free will and their ability to order their lives on their own in the world?
Right, right.
And people are different. Like some people might be more affected by one of these than the other. But on the whole, there would be a lot of free will would go out the window, if not the vast majority of it.
Yeah, and that's something that a good and loving God would want, is that creatures that are free and can make decisions on their own and recognize what the rewards are and what the punishments are, and there's a great good to that.
Yeah. I have the same intuition. I mean, I know there are some people that think differently than us, but I do.
Sure.
I tend to think that the image of God, right, is ultimately our capacity to be stewards and representatives of God. And God, I believe God is free. God has a nature, but within that nature is God's freedom. And if we're going to be real children of God, if God is going to be bringing more good into the world by sort of creating many gods, many people, I mean, that's what God is, maximizing value in the world. And he's creating a world where he's making other things that are, like him, incredibly valuable. And that's us. That's a big part of where our value comes from, is our being the image bearers of God. And that means that we, I think, also, in addition to having knowledge like God, although to a limited degree, and power like God, although to a limited degree, having free will. If God made his existence too overtly clear in this period, then in the very phase where we're supposed to be deciding freely who we're going to order our lives and give our lives to, God will have snuffed it out. And so we will have never, even if we come to be people who obey God perfectly, which we will be in heaven, but if we do it here and now, we will have never had the free choice. It will have been snuffed out. And so there's an important sense in which we no longer could be resemblers of God. The way God set it up now is we get to go through a phase so that our free decisions now echo through eternity. And what that means is that although we can no longer sin in heaven, we are rooted in our free decision that was made before. And so in heaven, we get to be the image bearers of God, even though we have no capacity to sin in heaven. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yep. So we're running low on time, but let's look at this last point here. I think it's really fascinating. The idea that, and if I'm following along correctly, that a non-theist can be in relationship with God.
Yeah. So remember, this is not the Christian, necessarily the Christian perspective. But
Right.
if you're someone that's raising an objection to the very notion of God, and you want to say that with hiddenness, or that hiddenness sabotages your ability to be in relationship with God, analytic philosophers are going to come and say, no, that doesn't necessarily follow. There can be exceptions to that. And it's really interesting how much has been written on this. But just to go through it here. So God can have a relationship with someone just fine, even while that person is a non-theist. And this is relevant because the reason God allegedly would prove his existence is in order to allow for relationship. And once again, that reason would be gone. So let's look at these. I'm just going through Belief Map here so I can read it with you. My browser's loading a little slowly, though. One moment. Do you have it open on yours?
Yes.
Okay, it just loaded. I'm trying to scroll down.
We've got a nice long quote from Daniel Howard Snyder that I see.
Oh, yeah. Great philosopher.
But just going through the points here, let's see here. He says, non-theists can still propositionally assume God exists. This is relevant because such an assuming of God's existence is sufficient for relationship. Ooh, that's getting quite technical.
Yeah, this is, once again, this is the analytic philosophers coming in. So yeah, there are different ways, there are different kinds of ways that you can not believe in God and still be in a relationship. And so, yeah, Howard Snyder goes through what gets called propositionally assuming. The one that's interesting, let's see here. Oh, yeah, so here's Wainwright's. And he gives a scripture. Let me preface his solution by reading this scripture from Matthew 25, 37 to 40. Quote, "Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? The king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me." And so what he's actually suggesting here is that take an atheist who doesn't believe God exists. Nevertheless, he relates to, and this is like in scare quotes, the good. He doesn't know what the good is, but he recognizes it as a thing. He doesn't call it God, and he tries to order his life in a way that follows it.
Yeah.
Even though he doesn't call it by the name of God or recognize it as God,
yeah.
Because in Christian philosophy, many of us believe that God is the good. God, this is the standard by which we measure good.
Yeah.
And whenever we ascribe the property of goodness to something else, what's happening in the background, what makes our property ascription true, is that it resembles God. The object in question resembles God in some relevant way.
So
that's what the property of goodness is. When a person relates to the good in this way, whether they know it or not, they're relating to God, and they're in a relationship with God, whether they like it or know it.
Yeah. So in this case, I would have in mind the atheist who says that they like some of the instructions of Jesus.
Yeah.
You know, and in this case, while I want to point out the inconsistency, I think, in only accepting some of them but not all, given who Jesus was, nevertheless, I want to encourage the atheist to do what Jesus teaches, because in doing that, they are relating to God, and they're going to recognize these deep objective truths, and that will then draw in them perhaps even, certainly an experience of God, but also in the hope that maybe God does exist. It sort of draws that out. Or at the very least, they might sort of pull a Pascalian wager here that maybe they should just pragmatically live as if God exists.
Yeah, absolutely. So listen to this question from Imran and Marcus. They published a piece in the International Journal for the Philosophy of Religion called "Some Critical Reflections on the Hiddenness Argument."
Okay.
And they go in for this type of response. They say, quote, "Suppose I'm an atheist and God speaks to me clearly through my conscience so that when faced with a moral decision, I have no hesitations about the proper course of action. I then respond to the voice of God in a firm and committed way. For example, in ending up doing the right thing, even though I do not believe that God exists. This state of affairs is certainly conceivable, and it's also conceivable in a way where my acting in accordance with the good is, as Wainwright proposes, more or less extensionally equivalent to acting on theistic belief, even though I do not hold the belief that there is a God." So that's just an example.
Yeah. Well, we're running short on time here. But certainly I want to encourage folks who have been following along today's show to check out your website and continue exploring. I mean, I can get lost, and I mean that in a good way. I can get lost in the material here. I don't mean because it's so well ordered and structured, but I can just get. I'd lose track of time. I think that
it's kind of like Wikipedia, where one thing leads to another, and if you ever just if you enjoy learning, you can. It keeps diving deeper.
Yeah,
it's awesome. A great way to learn, and it's a great if you're trying to familiarize yourself with the debate for and against, I think it's one of the most powerful ways to train yourself and to be prepared to give an answer for the hope that's in you to others.
Yeah, that's right. Blake, well, thank you so much for coming on today's show and guiding us through the complex issue here of divine hiddenness. But really, when we break it down, it doesn't have to be as complex as we might think it would be. It's as you said, the argument might be sort of death by 1,000 cuts. That really the scope here is more limited than people might expect. And having put in the research yourself and making it available to us is just in many ways a labor of love. But of course, for those people that are interested, you can go to Blake's website and financially support his work as well, so that he can afford more time and resources to building out the website even more. And so I'm sure he'd love to get your support for that. So,
very good.
All right, Blake. Well, thanks so much, and we'll have to bring you on another time and go through some other topic that you've got here on the site. Again, thanks for guiding us through that, and look forward to the next time.
My pleasure, man. Anytime.
All right, thanks. Take care.
You too. Bye.
All right. Well, I hope that was a good opportunity for you to maybe stretch your mind a bit more and to see how the point-counterpoint interaction works. And I also hope and pray that you'll have an opportunity to use Blake's website in the conversations that you might have. You'll see how helpful of a resource it is in your discussions with people. Because if we're not having these types of discussions with people, I think we're not really reaching out to the lost here. That reminds me of Paul when he visited Athens and he saw all the idols in the city. His spirit was moved, and he wanted to share the gospel with people. And I hope that you can look around and your spirit will be moved as well to begin having conversations with people that aren't Christians and or who might call themselves Christian but really might not understand, know, or even affirm what traditional historic Christianity has held in the core beliefs. And so you'll take that opportunity to have a conversation with them, and then you'll see how Blake's website here has already mapped out the conversation that you might be having with someone. All right, well, that does it for the show today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons and the partnerships that we have with our sponsors, Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Evolution 2.0, Fox Restoration, and Nonprofit Megaphone. Thank you to our technical producer today, Chris, and for our guest today, Blake Giunta, the founder of the BeliefMap.org website. And last but not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.